On New Year's Day 1943, Flight Lieutenant Dave Ritchie had a lucky escape after an encounter with 5 Bf-109s. He shot one down, but was forced to crash land his Kitty Hawk, which hit the ground at an estimated 350 miles per hour. The aircraft was split in two, so the remaining 109s didn't strafe the wreck as they usually did, as they obviously thought the pilot had been killed in the crash. Ritchie not only survived the crash, he hired a donkey from some Arabs and covered the 40 miles back to the squadron, riding the donkey through the front lines. In mid-January, the Luftwaffe launched a full-scale effort to protect their forward landing ground at Düfän, using new and newly repaired aircraft flown by newly arrived pilots. On the 14th of January, more than 20 109s attacked a formation of Boston light bombers, which 3 squadron were escorting to bomb Düfän.
Early in January, we had the worst catastrophe that occurred whilst I was flying with 3 Squadron. Fortunately for me, I wasn't on it, but Bob Gibbes was leading the 6 that were escorting the bombers, and then we had another 6 up in top cover, and a large number of 109s attacked head-on, which they never do, straight into it, and I think we lost either 7 or 9 in one go, including Bob Gibbes.
By the end of the day, 6 of the squadron's aircraft had failed to return, including squadron leader Bobby Gibbes. 3 of the pilots had been killed, 1 had been taken prisoner, 1 was captured but broke away 10 days later, and Bobby Gibbes made his way back after a few harrowing days in enemy territory.
But there were a lot being shot down the desert. Some got back. Brian Eaton was shot down, and 3 days after he came in riding a camel, I brought him back. Quite a few were brought back by the Bedouins that had keep them covered up. Bobby Gibbes, he was shot down, not very far from the front, and he buried himself in the sand for a couple of days until the enemy moved back. Then he came back. But when the Arabs brought them back, they gave them a piece of paper which said, "Be nice or be good to these people. They have brought a pilot back in safety." Well, these blokes would be on the road, they'd just flash that, they'd be picked up, treated like ruddy lords. It was a great passport for them. I guess they paid us money too.
We're escorting bombers, the American bombers, and we had to form up at low altitude to keep below the radar, say under 500 feet. And we had to go across, we're going to raid a place called Düfän. And we formed up with the American squadron at low altitude, and they all formed up very nicely, and away we all went, sticking down low. Now, I was the leader of the whole thing. The fighter leader was in charge of the bombers too. He could turn them back if he wanted, if it became necessary. And we were hoping to have the element of surprise, like flying over the water at low altitude, coming in over the land, and then we'd climb so we could bomb this aerodrome. Düfän. 2 109s flew over when we were halfway across the bay, and as was they obviously had seen us, so reconnaissance aircraft. I then gave the instructions to climb, so we all climbed like mad. By the time we got over the coast, the whole Luftwaffe was there waiting for us, and this is where we had all these aces that we discovered later. Anyway, one of them, they went in over the coast with a stack of 109s picking at us. We had some Spitfires as top cover. They were so damn high they didn't see a thing. They didn't come into it at all. But the 109s were coming down like rockets onto us, trying to go to the top squadrons who we had 3 squadrons above us, other than the Spitfires who were way up. And they were coming through at high speed and trying to get the bombers. We were obviously keeping them off the bombers. One of our pilots was shot down before we got to the aerodrome, and after we were climbing up to catch up on the way home, the show was all over. I looked down, one of my pilots was down below being shot up by 3 109s. So I called up our squadron. They had the squadron above us was supposed to be the attack squadron. I was supposed to stay right alongside the bombers. I called for them to go down and help him, someone to go down, and no one went. I gave a couple of calls, and it was quite serious. So I disobeyed all instructions. Well, yeah, they were on the way home anyway, so I dived down to try and help. I got there too late. Just as I got there, there were 3 109 attacking. I hit the lead 109. I think I got him. In the meantime, I watched my buddy go in and burn furiously. So I started then climbing up to try and catch the formation with the remaining 2 109s chasing me. We had learned how to avoid 109 attacks from astern by skidding slightly, by skidding your airplane slightly so it wouldn't be apparent to the guy shooting at you, but the bullets would go to one side. And then you'd wait to see the black coming off his wings to show his guns were firing, and then you'd take a violent evasive action from that juncture. And I had done this 2 or 3 times, and I was catching up with the formation above, and suddenly someone up above screamed, "Look out down below!" And I had lost sight of one of the 109s. I was watching an attack come in, but I'd lost the other one, so I panicked, and you shouldn't do that. And I turned, did a 360-degree turn. I went right through his cone of fire and got a cannon in the motor, which didn't seem to help much. And so I went down. I was fairly high by then, so I put in a vertical dive. I knew I'd had it. Went straight down and built up a speed of over 300 miles an hour. The 2 109s turned and came after me. So when I didn't want to have my controls shot away, thought if they hit my elevators, I would go straight in without control. So I pushed it onto the deck. I was still doing 300 when I last looked at the airspeed, and it's all fairly flat country with just a bit of salt bush around. So I probably bounced for 4 or 5 miles before I came to rest. And immediately I came to rest, I clambered out onto the wing, and the 2 109s came in. I thought, oh God, they're going to strafe me. They didn't. They went past at low altitude, and one of them either waved or saluted, and they were decent people. They probably knew I'd be picked up anyway. Anyway, I got home from that one. I had a few nasty moments getting back, of course, back through enemy lines. We were 170 miles behind the enemy, behind our lines, but I knew the army were going to attack that day, and I was praying like blazes they were successful, and they were. So I only walked about 50 miles in a straight line, but by wandering around, of course, I probably walked a fair bit more. And I was just getting over having had a broken ankle and a Pott's fracture. And I was probably unconsciously trying to help my left leg. My right leg was a crook one when I got in, which is I must have been favouring it.
On the January the 22nd, I was flying as one of the leaders in bottom cover to attack an airdrome at a place called Zuara, Zuara, which was just up past Tripoli, quite a way past Tripoli. And the idea was to knock this airdrome out if we could, any aircraft on it, because we were getting very close to Tripoli. And as we flew over Tripoli that day, we could see the New Zealand Army div moving in, and the trucks, everything streaming along the west to out of Tripoli. And actually, I think really that's the day Tripoli actually fell to the troops. Anyway, the top cover went across the Zuara airstrip first, and then we followed. I fired a long burst across the airdrome, and I think hit a few trucks and things on the road, and then we climbed up, and we were heading south into the desert when I saw three, apparently afterwards there were four, but I saw three 109s at Angels 2, that's another 2,000 feet above us, at 2 o'clock, and circling around to come behind us. So I called up our leader, who was one of the newer squadron commanders, and said, enemy aircraft 2 o'clock, and a voice said, I see them. So that's, you keep quiet then, you don't break radio silence. I watched them come around and around till they got right to 6 o'clock, the usual thing, and then they made their classic attack. And they dived down at, I suppose, 500 feet below us, and then came up underneath, and still nothing from the leader. So if that happens, you can call turnabout yourself, and everybody turns at the same time. So I said, turnabout right, Shabby, aircraft, go. Shabby was our call sign. And as I turned, I nearly hit the leader as I went around. Nobody else had got the message. Now, in the heat of the moment, I didn't really realise that they were not coming with me. I saw blue flashes on one of our own aeroplanes at the rear of our 6, and I'd opened up, and as they came up, they flew through the stream of lead that I was firing, but I didn't see any damage. And the next moment, I'm alone. At that speed, airplanes disappear very quickly, and I just couldn't believe all of a sudden that I was left there with 3 109s and a fourth that I didn't know about. But I should then, I think perhaps it was the shock value. You don't think very well when you get a shock like that. And I called out, give me a hand back here, a few adjectives if I remember rightly, and the next moment I'm twisting and turning amongst these 109s. But they did it very professionally. There was one on one side, one on the other, and one above me. If I turned into the one on the right, I exposed the belly of my aircraft to the one on the left. But I diced around with it for a little while. I think not flying terribly well, because I couldn't quite believe it still that I was left to it. If I had, I'd have rolled on my back, dived for the deck, because the Kitty Hawk used to dive very fast, being such a big, heavy aeroplane, and get right down to ground level and try to stream away from them. But having shot down that 109 a few days before, I was a little bit cocky, and I thought I might get one. But Major Munchenberg of the German Air Force, who'd already shot down 126, made me his 127th in fairly quick time. In actual fact, I wasn't going too badly when I felt this bang in the base of the aeroplane, and I felt my legs go numb below the knees, and some shrapnel had hit the throttle quadrant and opened up my hand a bit, but and the airplane went into a spin. But so I pushed the joystick forward to keep your airspeed, which you must do, to get out of a spin in a Kitty Hawk, kicked on the opposite rudder and held it, and she came out of the spin, still diving very quickly, and I knew she was flyable, so I began to think I'm going to be okay. And so I started pulling back on the stick and looking around to see that I wasn't being followed down, and I wasn't. So the aeroplane was pretty full of smoke, the cockpit. So I wound the canopy back rather than jettisoning it. I wasn't in much of a panic. And I started to pull it back to where she was almost straight and level, still looking around. I had heard a voice over the radio say, "There's one of your chaps in trouble back there, shabby aircraft." And that was 450 Squadron. They got my radio length, but nobody in my group had. And I knew I could feel the blood running down the back of my legs. So I knew what happened is that the shell had exploded, 20mm cannon shell exploded under the seat. And of course the armour plating's very thick that you're sitting on and your back, but there's no protection down from the seat down. So, but I thought, I'm going to be okay. So, as I say, I wound the canopy back, just had the aircraft just about straight and level, and a tongue of flame started to come in from the left main plane and over the edge of the cockpit. Now, my belief always was that those things, if they start to burn, get out. Don't attempt to crash land them, because so many chaps used to get down to perhaps 300 or 400 feet and then the aeroplane would blow up or they'd burn too much for them and they lose their lives. So I set about getting out pretty quickly, and I first went to pull my helmet off, and the strap, I suppose I was pulling down instead of out, but it was tight, and I couldn't get it off and quickly and easily. So I did two things. I made one mistake. I undid the Sutton harness and let go of the joystick to grab the helmet with both hands, and the aircraft was still very nose heavy with that big heavy engine, and it bunted me forward just like a cork out of a bottle. I went straight out at the top over the windscreen, smacking my knees on the windscreen as I went out. I felt my neck rick as the helmet came off with my oxygen mask and everything on it. And the next moment I'm in the air beside the burning aircraft, and I pulled the ripcord, and as I pulled the ripcord, the aircraft blew up, and the aeroplane just moved away immediately. You don't move when you're in a parachute. It's virtually like being suspended, but the airplane dropped away quickly, just a mass of flame. I just got singed a little bit over the eyebrows and forehead and a little bit on arm, and the parachute opened beautifully, and I had always had it pretty tight, and I had no problem with it opening.
Alan was captured and spent the rest of the war as a POW. By January 23rd, Tripoli had been captured by Montgomery's forces. Winston Churchill travelled there to personally congratulate the victorious 8th Army and the Desert Air Force on the 3rd of February. 3 Squadron began flying regular missions over the Mediterranean Sea, and in particular off the coast near Ben Gardain and in Zarzis Harbour. And so began the squadron's score of shipping targets, which grew substantially during the months to come. The squadron was moved forward again into southern Tunisia, where they conducted low-level airfield blitzes behind the Mareth line. Rommel had withdrawn to Tunisia, and after a massive loss at the beginning of March against the 8th Army, he requested they capitulate in North Africa. But Hitler refused to pull the remaining army out and replaced Rommel with General von Arnim. 3 Squadron had moved to Nefatia, where they, with other nearby squadrons in the wing, assisted the fighting French force of General Leclerc's strafe German tanks, armoured cars and supply trucks. Then, on the 21st of March, the squadron moved to Medellin, 10 miles from the front, to escort Boston's and Baltimore's bombing the still German-held Mareth line. The squadron operated from here, under shell fire from German 88mm guns, for several days. The air power applied by the combined Desert Air Force during the Battle of the Mareth Line was enormous. Montgomery's original plan was a full frontal assault, but failed to make progress, and the 8th Army suffered considerable loss of life and equipment. Number 3 Squadron then provided protection to General Tiny Freiberg's New Zealand Corps, which consisted of 27,000 men and 6,000 vehicles and guns, accompanied by British armour, circling around in a 100-mile march across the desert over 6 days, to penetrate the enemy's south flank of the Mareth line and attack the Tebaga Gap at El Hamma near Gibbes. 23 days after the start of the Mareth battles, the New Zealanders stormed this hard-won objective under the cover of well-coordinated air support, suppressing the German anti-tank guns. Of all the exploits and achievements of the Desert Air Force in Africa, the El Hamma breakthrough was probably their finest hour. It is commemorated with a separate battle honour on 3 Squadron's standard. Throughout April, Allied forces continued to take ground with a massive effort from 3 Squadron, pushing the enemy back to their stronghold in Tunis. On the 19th of April, after 274 operational sorties comprising almost 472 flying hours, Bobby Gibbes officially handed the squadron over to the new CO, Squadron Leader Brian Eaton. Gibbes left several days later, under orders to report to headquarters in Cairo for new assignment. He'd finished his second tour, becoming the squadron's second highest scorer, with 10.5 enemy aircraft destroyed, 5 probables, and 9 damaged. Finally, on the 7th of May 1943, Tunis fell to the original Desert Rats, the 11th Hussars of 7th Armoured Division, 8th Army. By the 12th of May 1943, General Graf von Sponeck had formally surrendered to General Freiberg, and the North African War was officially over. 3 Squadron was the only squadron in the Desert Air Force to have fought through every campaign of the Desert War, and they were cheered as the top-scoring fighter squadron within the Desert Air Force. To celebrate the end of the Desert War, 2 3-ton trucks were dispatched from the squadron's airfield in Kairouan on a 530-mile trip to Algeria to scrounge as much beer, wine, tobacco, chocolate, and any other luxuries that could be bought with £400 cash that had been collected from the men. The war in Europe had intensified. The Allied air forces began softening up the island of Sicily prior to a huge amphibious invasion just after midnight on the night of 9th-10th of July, to secure a stepping stone for the eventual landing in continental Italy. By the 19th of July 1943, a section of 3 Squadron had travelled by sea in landing craft directly from Africa to Sicily to join up with the rest of the squadron, who had arrived at Pacino airstrip via Malta with some of the latest long-tailed Kitty Hawks.
They didn't take all of our ground crew, they only took half the crew to look after us, but all the aircraft went across to Malta. And then from there we did targets over in Sicily. And then when they'd moved forward, our ground crew went across straight from Africa to Sicily. And we flew across to that place called Pacino, which was the first one. They were mostly we were dive bombing shipping in Catania harbour, and we were also attacking other targets up around Mount Etna, and various things, but without my logbook, it's a bit hard to recall. I got trouble with my hydraulic system from one of the flights coming back, and I actually ran off the end of the runway. They had 5 runways down that little island, and it was very dicey coming into land. You had to watch the other circuits, and each of them seemed to have a dip at the end of it. And there's actually a bomber aircraft went off the end of one of there, and I think the gunner was probably killed, the rear gunner. But that was our base to attack it, but apparently they moved up more quickly from the bottom of Sicily. The Germans moved more quickly, so we were able to go over much more quickly too.
At this stage, there were 7 Australian squadrons in the Mediterranean area, attached to the various RAF wings. They were operating from 6 widely spread bases, and they flew 6 different types of aircraft: Kitty Hawk and Hurricane fighters, and Wellington, Baltimore, Hudson and Halifax bombers. Another 9 Australian squadrons were based at RAF stations in the United Kingdom, making a total of 16 Australian squadrons poised for an intended attack on continental Italy and German-occupied Europe. 3 squadron flew their first 12 operational sorties from their new Sicilian base on the 24th of July, bombing enemy gun positions around Catania. Intensive strafing and bombing attacks were continued for weeks against the Axis front line and communications. Then the squadron moved further north to Agnone, closer to the German stronghold around Mount Etna. During these sorties, the Kitty Hawks constantly ran into heavy anti-aircraft fire. In one notable instance, when Sergeant Howell Price's aircraft was hit, he crashed into the sea. Squadron leader Reg Stevens sighted him swimming a half-mile offshore. Stevens flew above him until an air-sea rescue Walrus flying boat arrived, but shells from an enemy coastal gun prevented the Walrus from picking up Howell Price. So naturally, Stevens attacked and silenced the gun. However, his aircraft was hit and he was forced to crash land. Nevertheless, both pilots survived their ordeals and rejoined the squadron by nightfall. On the night of the 11th of August, a bombing attack destroyed a lot of the Tu-39 Wings aircraft, and over 80 airmen were killed or injured during the raid. Fortunately, 3 squadrons' personnel injuries were slight.
See, it was a totally different war. Sicily, I think, we were gradually getting aerial control. And I can't recall any more than one night of bombing in Sicily. Near the end, we had one very good one. They came over one night when we were at Agnone. It had been built on a swamp, and the Jerrys had used it. And they knew we'd be using it. And so what happened is 2 planes came over and dropped flares right up all around the strip, 2 green ones. And then the bombers came in, and of course all they did was fly up the channel between them, like drop bombs. And fortunately, a week before, we'd been moved from down there because malaria rate was too high. Millions of mosquitoes. Sicily leads the world in malaria. So they moved all the bods, left our tents down there. We had other tents up the side of a hill, a mile and a half, 2 miles away, up high. And the Royal Regiment looked after, the Royal Regiment of Guards belonging to the Air Force. They stayed down and guarded the place, and anyone else could stay down. We had quite a few sergeants stayed down there. They had their tent, they were quite happy. But anyway, this night, bloody hell was let loose down there. And when we could, we sent a Don R down to see if all our blokes were okay. They were, but quite a few of the RAAF regiment had been skittled, and lots of planes. The next morning we went down, they dropped these really big, probably 1,000-pounders, and they'd gone into the soft earth way down underneath, and delayed action hadn't gone off. I had one besides my tent down there. So I said, you better remove the tent. We moved the tent. I don't know when it went up, but it went up, and there'd be a crater 40 feet across and 30 feet deep. So the drone was speckled with them. The first job was to explode the unexploded ones, which made these big craters, get the bulldozers in and fill them all up. I think only half a day we lost. They had the whole strips finished, operating again.
On the 3rd of September, exactly 4 years after the war against Germany had commenced, 300 landing craft containing 8,000 8th Army troops, British and Canadian, left the eastern harbours of Sicily and crossed the straits to land, without much resistance, on the Calabrian shore. 3 Squadron continued to operate out of the Agnone landing grounds in Sicily, attacking enemy transports and supporting the landed forces until, on the 14th of September, an advance party from the squadron moved to an Italian airfield at Grottaglie, near Taranto, on the heel of Italy.
And the Anzio people had made a land, but they couldn't get off the beach. And the trenches were only 20 or 30 yards apart. couldn't call on bombers because they'd wipe both of them out. So they wanted fighter bombers. Well, we are way over in Sicily. No way could a fighter bomber fly from Sicily right across the other side of Italy and get back again. So they said, right, be ready to go in the morning and you'll land at Grottaglie in Sicily, in Italy. And they put an airborne division in, half at night, half next morning, took the place and secured it. But they only saw a couple of Germans, which they grabbed. Everybody had gone across to fight the landing. So it didn't take much to secure it at all. We landed, no trouble, no one firing at us anywhere. And I think I told you about getting stuck into refuelling, a hell of a job. Took a long time, but it was most successful.
The main force of the 8th Army and the US 5th Army had landed at Salerno on the Italian western coast, about 200 miles northwest of Grottaglie, and the Italians had simultaneously announced their surrender. The Allies nonetheless encountered heavy German resistance at Salerno, and having failed to secure a beachside airstrip, desperately called for external air support. So, from the moment that 3 Squadron landed on Italian soil, the small group of pilots and ground staff joined together to manually refuel and arm the Kitty Hawks. Within an hour, they'd taken off again to begin the first of many operations against the encircling German forces at Salerno. This flight, led by Brian Eaton, was the first Allied air formation to operate from an Italian mainland airbase. Another first for the squadron.
So Brian Eaton came to me and he said, pick enough troops to service 12 aircraft and petrol. You have got petrol had to go in 44-gallon drums, hand pumps, cooks and bottle washers, a few ambulance people. In other words, be able to operate in case anyone got hurt, they had to be taken care of. And we chuffed off about 10 o'clock in the morning, flying to Italy. We got over Italy and looking down at the lovely green fields there and vineyards. And that morning they'd put half an airborne division in to secure the area and had sent half the night before. And they had secured the area outside Taranto. And outside Taranto, 5-6 miles out, was Grottaglie airfield. So we landed on Grottaglie airfield, didn't see any Germans, but our Air Force was flying around us the whole way, top and bottom and side cover. We landed and some of the boys started refueling the aircraft while the others had a feed as soon as it was ready, changed over, and took a really long time to hand pump from 44-gallon drums all these aircraft. We had to get every bit we could into them. Then came the bombing up. What a ruddy job. Lifting 500-pounders up without a cradle, yuck. Anyway, we got the job done, and they chuffed off fairly late in the afternoon. Must have been 3 o'clock, might have been later. They chuffed off and, they must be gone 2.5 hours. They came back at night time, and we're on a strange strip. There's no lights or anything, no tankers, nothing there. So we had to put tins of kerosene out on the strip to market. And Brian Eaton came in, he made a perfect landing, no trouble. He was a pre-war bloke. Next bloke came in all right. The third bloke, he didn't seem to be moving, he pranged. We had 3 prangs out of the aircraft. I forget whether we had 12 or 15, but we had at least a dozen. We had 3 prangs, but that was a cheap thing to have to what they did. They got over there, didn't see any German aircraft, and they just bombed and strafed and used every bit of ammo, all this area where they were held up. And I forget the exact words, but next morning we had a signal from the Commander-in-Chief. I think it said something like, thank you, 3 Squadron, we're inland. They were able to get off the beach, and of course that started the big push up. And Monty soon caught up, and it was a big push. But the Germans used to hold us up a lot. The Mareth line, things like that, everything was stopped, everything stuck there. You'd have to blast your way through by air. Whole of the Desert Air Force would get onto some job and they'd just blast 5 or 6 miles out of the enemy. Bombs, you name it. Rockets.
Thanks for watching part 5 of 3 Squadron in North Africa. Be sure to tune into the next episode as we continue the story of 3 Squadron in the North African campaign.